welcome to the Hot Politics Lab. Today we have another Graduate Friday session. So we have Gustavo and Jakob who are going to be presenting today. Gustavo will go first. The presentations will be about 10 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A afterwards. Gustavo focuses on the neural correlates of political identity, specifically through using EEG. His presentation is entitled Politics at Face Value, Early Event-Related Potentials as Indices of Partisan Bias. If you have questions online, you can just type them in the chat box, and the floor is yours, Gustavo.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming for this presentation. Well, we've already heard the general concepts that are part of this presentation. But of course, political polarization is something that we discuss a lot in this lab. Jakob, my colleague, will be also getting a little bit more deeper into that, what constitutes it. I will be mostly focusing in the concept of partisan bias. Now, bias can be studied in many different ways. Generally speaking, what I will be speaking about in this presentation is mostly how individuals have a preference for their own party, like it better, and they dislike an out party. Simple concept. But you can measure it through, for example, explicit measures, by using feeling thermometers, which is the classic here. But you can also attempt to use more indirect scales and items that go for more complex behavior and thought processes. But then you also have implicit measures. For example, the implicit association test and brain activity. Here you can start getting into something that people normally would not be able to reveal through surveys, for example. And then the question is, how do they all relate together? Is there some sort of big picture that we can disentangle, and can we understand more about the mechanisms behind partisanship and partisan biases? Now, event-related potentials are one way that we can study this in EEG. The idea is that you use multiple electrodes to create channels, and then you study the topography and also the voltages throughout time. With ERP, you will want to average all of these different trials that you conduct with different sorts of protocols, and then you'll get these beautiful curves as long as you have enough trials. Now, out of this, then you can use time windows and channel clusters, and then we can try to detect overlapping components. Now, for the time being, I will only mention that you have components such as the VPP, the P1, the N170. All of this will seem like too much for you guys at the moment. That's totally fine. But if you have any other further questions about any of these specific components, please let me know. The literature sometimes is a bit clearer or a bit more general, depending on how much information we have about them. But either way, you may now wonder how much ERP research has been conducted when it comes to partisan identity. And in that case, most research that overlaps between group dynamics and ERP research uses facial presentation paradigms. But there doesn't seem to be anything quite concrete with partisan identity. So I conducted a review trying to find all studies that report any sort of ERP component that relates to that overlap there. And what I found is that most of the ERP components that are reported are the N170, the P200, and the N200. And then out of these, there seem to be two, the P200 and the N200, that are more often significant and also in the expected direction. So most studies seem to agree with each other. So we thought these would be the perfect candidates for such a study if we are to apply ERPs to partisanship. So we already had some data from Micah Holman. She conducted a previous project where she was interested in mu rhythms, so very different methodology in terms of analysis. But we can also use this data since she compares faces of in-party leaders and out-party leaders, but also faces of strangers, different comparisons that we can make. And in the end, the general idea is you're exposed to a face of a party leader for 2 seconds. Then there will be 2 seconds of morphing into a new expression. And then you'll have 2 seconds of a static emotional expression or neutral expression. Finally, having in this case, 5 seconds of getting to know whether or not you have to mimic that face or not. So it's a complex mimicry task. I'm not so interested in the rest. I'm only interested in the very first hundreds of milliseconds after the exposure of the first neutral face. So basically, how do people instantaneously react to seeing a face of a political leader? Is this some sort of really intrinsic index that we can find for partisanship? And by the way, did forget to say that we have, from this, we supposedly would have 50 participants, and we would have 48 trials for the politician versus non-politician condition, and 24 trials for the out-party versus in-party leader condition. Due to this, we also conducted a sensitivity analysis, and supposedly the smallest detectable effect size that we could find for the last comparison, the one that would be supposedly the weakest, would be something like 0.4 Cohen's d. But this is, of course, before rejecting any trials. Now, the hypotheses that we came up with go as default. Political leaders' faces should elicit a greater N170 and N200. This is because generally in the research, in the literature, they seem to be related to familiarity and similar concepts. While out-party leaders should be indexed by the P200, so when you see an out-party leader, you have a greater P200, while in-party leaders should elicit a greater N200 for their own specific meanings, which are discussed in the literature, but not always super clear. And then we do have some hypotheses on how partisanship strength, as measured through thermometers, could be related to the differences of voltage that we find between both conditions. So this ideally would be something that we really want to do, but we still haven't conducted those hypotheses, those analyses yet. And we used hands-free Python pipeline for pre-processing and analysis. We picked time windows and channel clusters based on the literature, and all of this was pre-registered as so. Now, in terms of results, after the pre-processing, we lost a couple of trials. So for the political versus non-political, we lost something like 10 trials. And for the out-party versus in-party, we lost something like 6 trials, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when you only have 24 to go with, it really is severe. And this will, of course, have implications for all of the results I'm about to show you. I ran some exploratory analyses for the P100, even though that I haven't mentioned it before. And that's because overall, I did find that this inflection to be quite significant and clean relatively to the rest of the data. And it's often been reported in the literature as well. In this case, it was non-significant for the politician versus non-politician case. As for the N170, it was also non-significant, but here we find a greater effect size, something like 0.2, which, as I already told you, should be kind of low given or number of trials. And then for the P200 and the N200, we also find non-significant results with very low effects, which like even if we increased it by a couple more trials and more participants, it still will be a very small effect, supposedly. Now, for the out-party versus in-party comparison, we found a 0.2 Cohen's d for the P100, but still non-significant. And the N170 was also non-significant with a much smaller effect size, and even smaller for the P200 and the N200. So generally speaking, and as you can kind of tell from the plots, there's a lot of noise, not a lot of trials, and the effect size, especially for the P200 and N200, if you look into the literature in general, are usually kind of small, meaning that it would be very difficult to detect such effect sizes with OR conditions. But if you look at, for example, some of the previous graphs, there might be something happening towards the later components that we cannot quite detect. And maybe there's something that goes on beyond. So maybe early neuromarkers, kind of weaker. Perhaps something later might be important that we're not really capturing here because it wasn't part of our initial hypotheses. So yeah, so the next steps would be to finish the analyses, see if there's any relationship between self-report, such as news consumption, or such as partisanship. Maybe there's a specific effect only for in-party or only for out-party that we cannot see because we're only comparing both. Also, there's some post-hoc analysis that we might do with other self-report variables that we do have. We can also check later components to see if there's something that we're not quite capturing with these plots. We could also use multivariate pattern analysis, which is basically a data-driven method, machine learning, that uses k-folding and would allow us to have more robust results for intervals that we're not quite inspecting and for clusters of channels that would not be quite intuitive for the literature that we do have. This might be the best option if we do want to see something pop out, but then we wouldn't necessarily be able to explain the results even if we have them. It might just inform us for the next study. And that brings us to designing a future EG study in which we would be doing, again, something that has never been quite done. So there's a lot of ways that we could approach this, multiple types of stimuli, behavioral protocols, self-report that we could include. And the idea would be try to further capture all of these possible implicit brain activity differences that exist that could then explain later more complex behavioral processes, such as, for example, as answering a survey, saying that you prefer one party over another. So yeah, if you have any questions, please let me know, and thank you.
Thank you so much for that very interesting talk. So we'll open the floor up now for questions.
You mentioned in the beginning, so this is one way of tapping a bit into this interpartialism and nicety. What is like your take on like what does it capture better and what does it maybe not?
So you mean like how we could capture it better, or what exactly aspect of it are we really capturing?
Yeah.
Right. So when you think of in these really early processes that happen within 100, 200, 300 milliseconds, what we could be looking at is basically visual processing and then the axis of in the temporal regions axis of memory. So it's basically us trying to categorize where we're looking at. So I wouldn't expect there to be very complex emotional processes already going on. I wouldn't expect something like anger, fear to be popping out, but it's more like the attentional systems that are being activated, allocated, so that we can approach something. And the idea for example, the P200, which is this face, for example, is that in the literature, a lot of studies use, for example, faces, black faces. So they compare white people, black people, Asian people, etc., to study in-group, out-group. But in a lot of these studies, since they're conducted in the United States, they focus on black faces. And this is where they usually find the greatest P200 results, for example. And even in other studies, sometimes when they use European faces that are not, that no one has prejudice for necessarily, this effect ceases to exist. So it seems to be more like allocation of attention towards a possible threat, something relevant that you have to pay attention for in the future, rather than necessarily you disliking something. But this attentional mechanism may underlie what comes later, which is a more biased tendency to see, oh, look, this person is doing something that I don't like. And that's something that we still are not really able to gauge from these results.
I forgot to say, super cool presentation, very cool take.
Right.
I have a question. I'm curious more how you're contextualizing your findings and how that's kind of going to shift where you look next.
Right.
And then you also mentioned an EEG study. So yeah, exactly how is that all? What do you think about that?
So by looking at these results, one thing that I can tell is that the region between 200 milliseconds and beyond seems to be the noisiest in general. That is just if we consider that this data is representative for other similar designs. It seems like the N117 P100, that this phase might be particularly interesting for next studies. However, I would say that things that are happening later would be the most relevant, because I also checked out some other studies, for example, when comparing familiar faces or celebrities to non-celebrities, and they find that there's also a phase that is quite important, perhaps some sort of evaluative phase that might be you processing exactly what you think about this person that you're being shown, that could be important for politicians' faces. Plus, in this study here, Micah uses faces of political leaders, not just politicians that are associated to certain parties. And this can bring a lot of emotional baggage that is very different depending on which specific politician you're being shown. And that's not ideal. So what I would like to do is to specifically look at strangers that now are associated with the party simply because of a pin that they have. So you start thinking, oh, they're from a party that I dislike, so therefore I will do something about that, cognitively speaking. And therefore, I would be interested in looking into the early ones still, later ones, and then relate to a more complex survey-based self-report. But I think that the stimuli, the number of trials, and an implicit association test would be the best things. Not so much like the intervals that we pick might be less interesting than the way that we actually conduct this next EEG study.
Yeah, thanks for the super interesting talk. It was cool to hear you talk about this now. You just mentioning that you might just show unknown faces that are somehow associated with the party. I thought that was a really interesting idea. Would you then try to frame those faces as political elites, or would you try to frame those basically as normal people that are still party members that are somehow like voters versus elites, basically. And would you expect those to maybe lead to different results? I don't know if you've thought about, but would you consider any of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not too sure what would exactly happen. So there are these studies studying minimal group. So like basically saying, hey, you're part of the analysts and they're part of the whatever. So it's like random terms, abstract concepts, and now you're somehow invested in that group and you're against that group. Some of these studies find results, but usually these effect sizes tend to be much smaller, much harder to capture. And then there's always a question of how relevant is it really, because these groups don't exist. So if we might be capturing something interesting, but that doesn't really apply to most other historically and contextualized groups. So to be able to associate strangers that are not party members to strangers that are just people that like a certain party, it's interesting, but I feel like one would create much greater effect sizes, I would suppose, and therefore it would be easier to come up with a design to study it, while the other, it would be like, it's interesting, but it's also very likely that we wouldn't find results simply by how weak it might be. You know, so it's something that could be tried, but since you've already seen that we need so many trials for every single condition that we try, we need to be a little bit conservative. Therefore, I would try to go for something more potent,
Yeah,
like
try those strongest manipulation.
yeah, like this person is part of this party and represents these ideologies, something like that.
Thanks.
Can you say a little bit more about the post-hoc analyses that you plan and what your expectations there would be?
Yeah, so here I have, for example, the self-reported media consumption. And so supposedly people that consume more media might have greater ERPs for politicians' faces, for example, or maybe even specifically for odd party. But I don't have high hopes for that specific type of analysis. The type of analysis that I would be interested in looking into is, let me see if this is the right graph. Yeah, it's to see if beyond this time frame and that time frame, if things eventually become less noisy and we might find some statistical difference. But still, I don't think that these post-hoc analyses will really change my perspective on the study, and they were not really the goal to begin with. I think if anything, MVPA might be the best approach, because it might really reveal something we're not expecting, and we couldn't, because we're just going by a literature that had specific goals and specific traditions, and we want to break away from that.
We have a question online, and then we'll go to Sam and then. So Micah says, thanks for your great presentation. And a shame I couldn't be there in person. I was wondering whether this ERP research also looks at the moments before the stimulus presentation. In your graph, it looks like there might be something going on just before in the anticipation.
Yeah, so there are some studies that study anticipation. The problem with this is that, well, in our study, for example, is that before people are exposed to the neutral phases, they're exposed to emotional phases, and they're also asked to mimic. So there could be a lot of noise and also all sorts of different trials going on before that could make this baseline period complex. So I wouldn't, like, at least personally, given what I've read, I wouldn't think something very interesting would pop out there. And we mostly use this phase as a baseline to then subtract, to basically have the window that we're using, and we subtract it by the baseline. That's the idea, at least. But yeah, there's some studies, I can't remember which specific ERPs, that study anticipation, for example, when it comes to threat paradigms, but we're not doing that in this case.
Thank you. Would you expect there, if you look at like multiple, would you expect there to be a big difference depending on how much you dislike the ad party?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and Jakob will also be talking a little bit about different sorts of measures for polarization and partisanship. So Mike, in this case, used 2 in-party leaders and 2 out-party leaders, and the idea was to basically average both and then compare. So let's say that you have one party leader that you have a very specific opinion for, that could derail things. But if you have 2 of each and you average, that should make things a little bit more balanced. And then you can have an out party and an in party. It's a bit artificial. It's not like in the United States where you can just pick 2 people. And in here, it would be very difficult to just use every single party leader, a lot of which might be from very small parties that you don't even know. So I guess this was the best approach that they had. Did this answer your question?
I have a question. Maybe this is because I did not get the beginning well enough, but are you looking also at the interaction effect between the familiarity and the in-group and out-group? Because what I am sensing now is that you might actually present people very familiar leader spaces, and that's why you are not seeing any difference, because the first response is attention to a familiar face, right? Or maybe unfamiliar, I don't know, depending on the information of this post-hoc test that you might be running.
But by the familiarity effect, I mean, that's one of the things that we're trying to measure as well, using the N200 and the N170 between the politicians and non-politicians.
So you run an interaction as well there? So you would have.
Oh, you mean like the person gaining familiarity over time, you mean?
No, so you can still have an unfamiliar face of a politician that is an out group, and you can have a familiar face of a
No.
Yeah, but that's
Okay.
that's actually when I was thinking about this research with the black faces, right?
Mm.
It might be having two
Yeah.
mechanisms. It might
Yeah.
be just, oh, I've never seen a person like that
Yeah.
in my life, or it might be this is
Okay,
expected.
yeah. So
Right.
that's a really good question, actually. In the literature, they use. I misunderstood. No,
We're on LinkedIn.
because like in the literature, there are basically two explanations for the N200 effects in this specific 34 studies that I looked into. So they either think it's inhibition, which is like, I'm not sure why like inhibition would be related to this. It's kind of a, and the other explanation is familiarity. If you're studying strangers' faces, you wouldn't expect familiarity to be a big thing unless you just have more contact with a specific race, for example. So there could be a familiarity effect. The inhibition part, I'm not so sure of. But the problem is that like all of these assumptions that are made about what the ERPs are actually doing are not based on a lot. They're based on different designs. So you use a design for familiarity or use a design for inhibition, and then you extrapolate from there into different fields. But in reality, like they're not quite sure what it means. And I think we would have to conduct another study where familiarity would be better disentangled in order to answer that.
Eric, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Gustavo. One question that I've been wondering about is you extrapolate the literature on in-groups and out-groups, so race to politics. But politics might just be a lot less salient identity for people.
Yeah.
So should we not actually expect no findings? Because these distinctions you have gotten from this other literature are on a very salient, often also done in the US. Well, here we're studying a much less salient political identity. And I think this is a broader critique of this literature, which has been using group identity theory towards politics, well, the ordering of identity. So could this explain the absence of results?
Yeah, so one problem when it comes to the more racial literature is that there's huge cultural baggage, super complex. Every country, every region, every community will have different impressions about different races and so on, which makes it much harder to extrapolate to basically anything else, even between studies. In the case of politics, there's one advantage where it's quite simple, where you supposedly dislike the out group and you supposedly like the in group. And with race, it's not necessarily like that. And in this case, if you see a face of an out party leader that you really dislike, and from what I've seen of the scores of partisanship, people usually gave very low thermometer scores for the out party. I would expect there to be a similar effect or even stronger than seeing a race that you might have some prejudices for. The difference is just how explicit you are about it, because I think people are much more open about how politically polarized they are, and maybe not so open about how racially polarized they are. But I think that given how polarization has been changing, at least in the Western world, I would think that you would find similar effects, and they would be easier to study. They would be more comparable between different cultures and political systems, because it would be a much simpler out-group in-group conflict rather than a much more complex culturally, racially mosaic of impressions.
I think that's all the time we have. So thank you again very much. Up next, we have Jakob, who is going to give us a study on affective polarization, and he particularly is interested in development of polarizing attitudes among adolescents.
You had the flag on your boat. Oh, Gustavo.
No, it's just flag for both of us.
And the mounted
Under the same grant. Yeah, I'm going to talk about affective polarization and its conceptualization, and more specifically, how we can make the construct a little bit more affective. So affective polarization is a very prominent topic. And just in 2023, it got over 11,000 hits on Google Scholar. And it's so prominent because it's linked to political events such as increasing inter-party hostility surrounding the elections in the United States. But also, yeah, it has been transferred to other multi-party systems and linked to relevant outcomes such as political engagement, but also how much people value democratic norms. So what is affective polarization? I first want to decompose the terms a little bit. Affective. So affective is generally an emotional reaction or the subjective experience of an emotion. And it can encompass the subjective experience only, but also the physiological response or the behavioral or expressive response. Second part of the term is polarization. That is often a term used to describe a division within society, for example, based on political ideology or also other attitudes or identities. And the overall term then affective polarization, as Gustavo has pointed out, is used to describe the liking for one's political in-group and the related dislike for one's political out-group. Those two things are contrasted. How do we measure that usually? We would ask people, how much do you like the parties within your country? And what we would then calculate is a spread score. So we would actually look at how much does the like spread out across the political spectrum. And we would have on the one side a person that is affectively polarized, that has a high spread of liking, which means that they very much like one party or a group of parties and very much dislike another group of parties or a political outgroup. And we have people that are not affectively polarized. Those have uniform feelings towards all parties, be they positive or negative. So my claim now is, or my question is, how affective is this conceptualization of affective polarization? Because it captures really well the polarization part. People distinguish very strongly between the political parties, but how emotional are they about it? You could imagine a person that is highly politically engaged, highly emotional about politics, and has a rather left-wing orientation. So this person rates all the left parties highly on sympathy, the right parties low on sympathy, and therefore would be classified as polarized. But you could also imagine a person that is rather disengaged from politics, but is living in a very, very liberal environment, is also slightly concerned by the recent Dutch parliamentary outcomes, and scores similarly on this scale. And even though their preferences when it comes to parties might be similar on this spread scale, I would argue that their affect towards politics and towards the political parties can be relatively different. And so my idea is to include another dimension to this measurement of affective polarization, namely derived from theories of emotions and arousal dimensions. So not only measure how much do people differentiate between the different political parties, but also how intense are their emotions when they think about those political parties. So that we could further distinguish on the spectrum of spread of like-dislike between the people that differentiate very much between the political parties and are highly emotional, the people that do so and are not very emotional about those political parties, the people that are completely disengaged, so they don't differentiate between the different political parties and are not very emotional about politics, and the people that don't really differentiate between them and have uniform feelings, but are still very emotional about the different political parties. So my research questions in general for this very explorative phase of the project is, do people with similar spread of like and dislike ratings also differ in their terms of arousal? And does arousal matter for the associations with different political correlates? And to do so, we had an initial survey of around 500 Dutch participants. And we first had our new measure of affective polarization. There we asked people, how do you feel about, and then a variety of parties on a scale from very negative to very positive, which for us mirrors this like-dislike questions from the original affective polarization measure. And secondly, we asked, how intense are your feelings? So that would be a question of arousal. Then we had a battery of different political correlates and also some psychological dispositions that were also used in other projects. And at the end of the survey, we had the classical affective polarization feeling thermometer question. How much do you like the following parties? So to respond to this first research question, I'm just going to quickly walk you through the different constructs that we're talking about. The first one is the spread of like-dislike that we usually use to measure affective polarization. The second is the spread of valence that, so our hunch mirrors the spread of dislike and like measure. And the last one is the mean arousal. So on average, how emotional do they feel about the political parties? First, we're looking at the spread of valence and its relationship to the spread of like and dislike scores to see if those are actually similar measures. And what we find is an almost perfect correlation between the two. So we're going to use the two of them interchangeably in what follows. Secondly, we looked at the relationship between spread of valence and mean arousal. So I have spread of valence here on the x-axis and mean arousal on the y-axis. And those quadrants were based on the midpoint of the scale of mean arousal and on the mathematical midpoint of the spread of valence scale that was derived via a simulation and not based on our actual data. So this is the midpoint of the scale, not the mean of our sample. And if we would have a perfect correlation between spread of valence and mean arousal, that would essentially mean that everything that is captured in arousal is already captured in spread of valence, and we wouldn't need another dimension. But what we actually see is that the people are very much spread out across those four quadrants, and we only have a very small positive relationship between the two, which gave us hope that mean arousal might add something to the construct overall. To further see if arousal matters for the associations, we looked at the associations with different political correlates, and here focused on strength of ideology, political sophistication. So that was a measure of confidence in one's knowledge, political efficacy, and political interest. How, on average, how likely people were to engage in different forms of political activism, as well as how much political news they consume. I'm here plotting the standardized effects of spread of valence, mean arousal, and also interaction. I also ran a multiplicative model for the different outcome variables. And I also set standardized the different outcome variables because they're on very different scales, just to make them a little bit more comparable when I plot them here. So for strength of ideology, we see positive effects of spread of valence, but also of mean arousal. That is, the people that are more polarized according to the usual measurement are also more or have a stronger ideological stance, but we also have an additional positive effect of our mean arousal measure. We do not find an interaction. For political sophistication, we have a similar picture. We do find positive effects of spread of valence and mean arousal. So the people that distinguish further between the different political parties, but also the people that are more emotional are scored higher on political sophistication. Again, no interaction. If we look at political activism, we actually do not find an effect of the spread of valence measure. So the original conceptualization, when we put it into one model with mean arousal, but we do find a positive effect of mean arousal. So the people that are more emotional on average about political parties were in our sample more likely to engage in political activism. Of course, those are only correlative results. Again, no interaction. And for political news consumption, we also have those two positive effects, main effects of spread of valence and mean arousal, and no interaction. So, of course, those are only some initial results. We also ran some model performance analyses to see whether the models with only valence or with only arousal have a better fit. And we also have some data on psychological dispositions. So I would be also very happy to discuss alternatives to how we can further explore and extend the post-research questions or analyses. But as is, our conclusion is a little bit, arousal seems to matter, and it seems to add something in the way that it is related to other political variables that we might care about. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakob. We'll go to some questions. Roland?
Yeah, very interesting thought. I wonder, for me, it seems like a logical follow-up study to ask the question of liking or disliking the party in a lab, and actually look at physiological arousal, heart rate variability, or semiconductors levels. I'm answering this question.
Yes, I actually have no experience with that whatsoever, but I think I'm in very good company. And I do agree that this is very much a logical question, follow-up question, because I think those physiological measurements that we use very much in the lab do equip us very well with techniques with which we can very well detect valence or arousal, maybe even a little bit more effectively. Yeah.
Thanks. Great talk. I was, it's really interesting to hear about all of this. I found the quadrants that you put up pretty interesting. So especially the hot but not polarized quadrant. I don't know if because that's the least that's the one you would least expect.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I don't know if you've already kind of classified that group, or if you can tell me a bit more about that group, or if you're going to focus on them in future analyses, just because that's something I would not expect to find, but then based on your plots, apparently they do exist.
Yeah, the presentation I think is a little bit buggy because when I put the high resolution plots, they kind of like interfere with PowerPoint. I think I just wanted to pull up the plot, but I can't now. I think I think that is super interesting group, and I would have expected the least amount of people in there. And I'm also not really sure. I can only speculate on like who are those people. One thing that I was thinking about to maybe look at is how the people that fall in this quadrant feel on average about the political parties. Because one explanation that I had, but again, that's only speculation, is that those could be a group of people that just hate everybody, which is why they are very much aroused, and which is why they are not particularly polarized in the sense that they don't differentiate much between the political parties. But that would be something that I would still have to look into. And I'm very much interested in what constitutes the different groups as well. Yeah.
Really explanation. They might not be polarized on a political party level, but maybe on a level where you compare political parties in general with almost.
Maybe.
Interesting. Yeah.
Olga?
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Jakob. Yeah, that's super fascinating, and also I think helps us to get a step further again to understanding whatever that thing is, that thermometer question that's been going around for a while. So one thing I wondered about is a relation to sort of discussion has been going on about how we should understand the object of affective polarization. So your items are about parties in the abstract, right? Which I think we know people would impute with political elites. Right? We think about political leaders or the parties as actors in The Hague in this case. But others have been interested in polarization in society at large, right? How groups of supporters think about each other. And I also wondered whether it actually how your framework sort of relates to that. I think there might be an extra step because there's a group that will care a lot about what politicians are doing, our elites, and get aroused there, but might not really judge their fellow citizens for that so much, right? Where others do, right? They do fight over Christmas dinners, etc., over politics. Right? So I wonder if an extension with different objects and arousal towards different objects politically speaking, what your thoughts are, if your framework could sort of explain something about that too.
Yeah, that's actually the other 500 participants of the study, and I didn't have time to present those results. But I think that is a very interesting distinction, especially when it comes to also the arousal dimension. So how strongly do people feel, how intense are their emotions when thinking about other people within society, regular people that have different political identities. What I can tell from the results that we have so far is that the mean levels don't seem to differ too much between when we ask about parties and when we ask about citizens, but the relationships with other constructs, not only the ones that I just presented, disappear a little bit. And that is for spread of valence as well as mean arousal. So, and I'm not really sure, it would be also interesting to hear your take on it, but I'm not really sure if this question is just more difficult for people to respond to. If you ask them, how do you, I don't know. I think like maybe it is a more difficult question to approach for participants. So it might be a little bit of a noisier measurement, but I do think it's relevant because if we're talking about affective polarization, we are most of the time referring to people hating each other within society, or very, very often we're talking about that. So I do think it's very relevant, and I'm definitely planning to look into that a little bit more.
I have a question online, and then we'll go back there. This is from Luca. So they say, interesting argument and cool approach. You argue that affect is currently lacking in affective polarization measures. Can you explain again what, in your view, the current measure assesses, if not affective polarization? And if your measurement gets more support throughout your project, what needs to change? Our measure of affective polarization or the concept?
Can you repeat
Can you explain again, in your view, what the current measure assesses, if not affective polarization?
I do think that it assesses affective polarization because it does have this, I think, this like or dislike that can be interpreted as a matter of positive affect and negative affect. And so it technically focuses also on the same thing, and it also definitely has the polarization component in the sense that, in particular, the spread score focuses on whether you do have those opposing camps in your sympathy towards different political groups. So the idea was not to say that the original measure does not measure affective polarization at all. The idea is just to focus also a little bit more on the first aspect, since I think that while the feeling thermometer measurement also measures both parts of the construct, so far the stress has been a little bit on the second part of it, on the polarization part, and not so much on the affect. And I'm wondering if focusing more on the affect could also be beneficial, since it might also allow for some other experimental research, as Roland has said, with physiological data, or if it might also be something that would be more prone to manipulation in the lab and for experimental research, because it's very hard to change people's attitudes about different political parties, but it might be a little bit easier to change their arousal in a lab setting.
You kind of answered this second part. If your measurement gets more support, what needs to change? Would it be our measure or the concept itself of affective polarization?
That is a very big question. I don't know. I think, refer to a very nice review paper by Markus Wagner that has just been published, where he talks about the different challenges of affective polarization. And I do think that we do, like, with regards to the concept, there are challenges in the way that we measure it, but also challenges in the way we define the different measures, because so far we are grouping a lot of things under the term affective polarization. So, for example, outgroup dislike is sometimes also called affective polarization, even though it doesn't necessarily capture what we are capturing when we're talking about affective polarization with regards to the threat to the spread measure. So I think we need to be a little bit more specific about what we're talking about, what our definition of affective polarization is, and also a little bit clearer of what the consequences of the different operationalizations are. Because the results that we find for one measure of it might not be generalizable across the spectrum.
You had a question in the back?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, apologies if you said this already. When did you do the survey?
We did the survey in December, I think.
Okay, because I was just thinking, and I understand that that wasn't fully maybe the intention of the study, but especially in the Netherlands, I would say, especially arousal sort of within politics, getting hot and bothered has been more and more, and especially with the elections that just happened. So I guess especially if you did this in December, you would, it kind of feels like emotions are heightened at the moment, if you will. So I was just wondering if you could speak to the fact, maybe if you would have done them before the elections or even after, how do you think maybe it would have changed what you discussed?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. I'm actually not quite sure. Obviously, I think if you track different metrics of how politically engaged people are, also, even if you look at how people's attitudes crystallize, such heavy information flow events as the elections definitely have an influence. And I can certainly imagine that this strengthened people's perception of the different political parties, because they just had to make up their mind about the different political parties. And especially also with the news surrounding the election, I'm sure that it also had an influence on the arousal measure. So I definitely think that that is something to take into consideration and maybe, replicate that in other times. Then again, it seems like with the news that we are daily exposed to, it seems like the flow of information with regards to, like, political information, political scandals, highly emotional events is now higher than it has ever been before. So yeah.
Philip, I think you had a question.
Thanks, Jakob. Great talk. And I think this is one of the best examples where a graph that shows hardly any association sparks a lot of excitement. A lot of variants to explore. And I think one cool thing is also with this whole AP research, we're always about these like certain effects along this continuum, and we don't really know what they mean. And sometimes they explain desirable outcomes, sometimes undesirable outcomes. And I think with this, you're kind of tapping also this comparison into these four types. You're tapping into this, trying to get a bit of a give some texture to what we're actually talking about, which is really important, I think. And we could also, I mean, already Isabella, but also Jana, we talked about Jana from Ipsos work, like tap into this like hobbyism, you could say, or like political junkies. And I think trying to conceptualize, like maybe even give it a bit of an inductive touch, even if it's just to sharpen your own intuition, an exploratory touch of like, okay, we have the disgruntled citizens, the negative partisans, anti-partisans that have like no whatsoever party identification. We have those that are political junkies that just like listen to everything. And so actually, you could, for instance, throw all these variables that you have now as dependent and independent variables into one big Kasper analysis where people are confident about their political image and high in arousal. And with that, try to sort of disaggregate or like understand this variance that you see in this nice plot. That, at least for me, would be very interesting.
That's a super interesting idea. Yeah, I would love to do that actually. And I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about that because it sounds super interesting. And this characterization of those different clusters, I think would be very interesting to explore. I do have to look a little bit at the data because we had some like complex like rerouting within the survey. So I only have like 60 participants that have actually data on all the different variables. But I think there's definitely some workaround, and I think that this is a really, really good idea, and I would love to explore that.
Short follow-up, also the citizen question could actually be informative for that, depending on how it's worded. So if it's worded as in a strong, like a VVD supporter or whatever, or just somebody who, if they would vote, well, they would vote for VVD, right? Then it also taps into this difference of like, is this about just like not wanting politics or strong identification, or is it just about that group, right? The minimum signal of the output, which should be enough for AP.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, I would love to look into that. I think the citizen question was more about like a voter of that party. And I think I haven't mentioned that, but that is a between group factor that we have because we we shied away from asking them 4 times and certainly about affective polarization. But I think that makes it even also more interesting because you could look at what characterizes those different clusters, and does that change if we're looking at citizen or if we're looking at like the vertical polarization when people think about the political parties.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a really interesting result. And I was wondering if you also looked at the correlation of the raw scores, if you have raw arousal scores and the raw thermometer scores, if there were any association.
Yes, the raw arousal scores and the raw thermometer scores. So I think they correlate at like 0.1 to 0.2, or I think around 0.2. So also rather low. And I also looked at the folded relationship, because you could obviously imagine that the people that are very negative or very positive about a party, and they were also like not too big, the correlations, which surprised me a little bit.
Yeah, that's good to know, because I think when you compare like mean scores or like related mean scores and standard deviations, it could even be that they're completely independent, both variables, even though both variables measure exactly the same. Because like if they're both normally distributed, the mean is by definition independent of the standard deviation or the variance. But in this case, I think it's good that you looked at this and that the correlation is also quite low.
Really interesting. Fascinating that you find these almost orthogonal dimensions that mimics a lot of what you find in theories of psychology applied to facial expressions or to words, what the original model was about. But those have been extended later with a third dimension, which is dominance. Therefore, this would be, in this context of polarization, it's really interesting to look at as well. So you have a plan of integrating dominance too.
We haven't thought about dominance. I'm also not too familiar with the concept. I mean, I have looked a little bit into extensions of those two dimensions. So, for example, we could also imagine that something like perceived polarization would play a role, or things like that. I'm not sure. How would you apply dominance in that context? I mean,
So I know this from facial expression research, and that's about how controlled you feel by whatever you see. So do you feel controlled by it, or do you feel in control? So that's the dimension that you measure on. That's orthogonal to the other two. If you do PCA on ratings of this, then that comes out as a third low dimension that explains less variance than the first two, but it's still another dimension.
That's super interesting. I'd love to look into it, but I must say that I don't have I don't have yet a response of how I would integrate that in the framework. Yeah.
But would you say it's control? Is it control about your feelings about other parties, or control about politics, or?
Does it make you feel in control or controlled by the party? I guess. Yeah. So it's an affective dimension. So so angry faces are often more that you feel controlled by it, versus a calm face you would feel more in control. I guess you could find a way of phrasing that towards politics.
Joe, I think one more pragmatic answer would be to Jakob will have a hard job convincing anybody to add more items to any large set survey. So you come with a third dimension. And the honest answer is we don't like more than 2 items.
Well, I don't know after the comment by so you are on a mission to show us that there is more into affective polarization, and I was thinking about the fact that you have this balance, but we still don't know what is actually under this negative or positive feeling towards the side, right? And then I was thinking, if I am angry with the other side, I might be having different outcomes in terms of my political behavior if I fear them, or if I have some other strong feeling. I don't know what that could be. So could you disentangle it, maybe in the follow-up studies, what these feelings are that they are experiencing, right? And then the other thing that I was thinking about is now I still don't know whether you are finding something specific about the politics, or you're finding something that is an individual difference, like how much feelings do we feel as an individual, right? So you might have people that just, well, haters gonna hate, right? So it doesn't matter whether it's the husband leaving the dishes behind in the sink, or it is the outro.
This is a recent example.
But you know what I mean, right? That you might be just capturing something about the individuals and the propensity to feel particular, affects. Maybe that's something also to think about. Can we be polarized about non-political things? Because then you could have, you could measure those responses on some items that are not political and not related to political parties, to see whether you still get this affect among some people and not among others, and that's related to politics or not.
Great questions. The first for the
follow-ups.
yeah, definitely. First to the first question, I was also thinking about that. We didn't ask, I think, about the different emotions, because so far I wasn't yet sure how do I, because those, like the arousal measure as well as the spread of valence measure, always is like a measure that is essentially taking the scores for all the different political parties and calculating a score for each participant. And the emotions are often a little bit more tied to a specific political outgroup. So I wasn't sure how I would actually map that onto, but I think that would be super interesting to look into. I'm not sure if it would make sense to maybe look a little bit in dispositional factors, or what emotions people generally feel when they think about politics or something like that. That would certainly be something that you could integrate. But maybe also, like with Philip's suggestion, you could get at something similar to that, like look a little bit what characterizes those different people, and maybe maybe a little bit more about the underlying motivations of their ratings. And the second question, I think that it would also be super interesting to explore. I mean, you definitely can be polarized about other things. There's a whole other literature about like polarization about topics, ideological polarization, and you could definitely relate the two constructs, or also maybe just capture arousal or general arousal towards other things and use it as a control in an analysis or something like that. And I think that would, yeah, be really interesting to answer the question. Is it just the people that are generally more aroused, or the people that are more aroused when thinking about those different political parties?
Quick question. Yeah. What is the correlation between like neuroticism and arousal?
The correlation is positive. It's that's the first thing, because I was at the beginning. Yeah. The correlation is positive. I'm not quite sure what it is. It's rather small. Like with the different personality dispositions, like as usually the more like the closer you get to politics, the higher the correlations. But if you have those very distant personality factors, the correlations kind of like tend to go around like 0.1 or something like that. Yeah.
When you're measuring arousal, was it specifically about the political parties, or did you also do it for conceptualizing like photos of that party? Did you do it for both, or just the party?
Both, like in two conditions. So with one condition in which we had the valence as well as the arousal measures for different political parties, and another condition in which we had both questions for about voters. So yeah, we also have the arousal questions specifically about the different voters.
I guess I'm curious, do you think that that is then influenced by anything in particular? Like, I imagine who comes to mind when you think of a opposite party voter would matter a lot for that, right? But do you have any way of clarifying that question? Because you said it started to get a bit noisy when you were doing that analysis.
Yeah, no, I'm actually not quite sure what people think about it. And I think that is some really important work that has to be done there. Like, who do people think about? Because I guess most people, they do act either in environments that are politically homogenous, or as also like some current research has shown, people just defer from talking politics, just don't like to talk about it too much. So I'm not quite sure what they're thinking of. They don't seem to think of the leaders, because otherwise I would imagine that the associations are a little bit more similar if we're asking about voters and if we ask about party leaders. But I think it's super interesting, maybe also to qualitatively ask people, who do you think of when you think of a voter of this party?
I think that's all we have time for. So thank you again, Jakob.